I've tackled the issue of lacking standards for HDR content a few times before, and it remains an issue to this day, with no standard certification available yet for PC monitors to adhere to when supposedly supporting HDR content. However, in the TV space, this definition has been defined for quite a while with the Ultra HD Premium certification, and the TV space is ahead in most respects when it comes to this stuff. Now, interestingly, the Ultra HDR forum has released their guidelines for what's known as Phase B, for outlining what companies who stream TV content should be achieving in terms of technical specs, and it gives quite an interesting look into the future. Phase A, for those interested, was aimed at Ultra HD content currently in use. So let's start with the most interesting part of this. Frame rate. With developing technology, frame rate is increasingly becoming a spec that people are paying attention to thanks to diminishing returns on resolutions above 4K. And obviously as PC users, we have long been in love with the highest frame rates possible. Of course though, TVs have never broken the 60Hz barrier. Well, until the beautiful large format Acer, Asus and HP displays. But for every other TV, there has been no increase, and even those new TVs can only display higher FPS content driven by PCs, as no TV channels are broadcasting higher than 60 FPS. So it surprised me to read that this specification is stating the desired support of 120 FPS, or 100 FPS depending on your region. This is down to some regions using 50 FPS and some 60, and so the two options ensure backwards compatibility when streaming content in the future, as the stream can be easily halved to make life easy for anyone consuming the same content just on older setups. Of course, frame rates are absolutely fantastic for any kind of content, but whilst TVs and movies are likely going to remain at their standard frame rates for an artistic reason, content like sport would benefit incredibly from the increased data output. You'd be able to track fast moving objects like a tennis ball or football with a fluidity we literally have never seen before. Now interestingly, a reason for this desired higher frame rate is that HDR content apparently, and this was news to me due to my very little exposure time to HDR content, is susceptible to motion judder, so a higher frame rate would eradicate this issue. The reason for this motion judder, it turns out, is because of the increased contrast representation in the detail on screen. The larger and brighter the display, the more obvious and objectionable the visible judder. What stems from this is another curious tangent, how HDR affects low frame rate content such as movies, because whilst changing shutter angles, exposure time, lighting power frequencies and such can aid the removal of judder to an extent, they're still going to be susceptible to the judder issue in fast moving scenes more noticeably. Of course, because movies and TVs can be edited after the fact, it may be possible for the artificial removal of the judder in post, but yeah, maybe HDR content and the continued progression towards ever more realistic display quality may push all content formats towards higher frame rates. Food for thought. HDR is obviously a large part of the future of TV content. However, the thing that stood out most happily for me is the focus on Dolby Vision rather than HDR10. Dolby Vision is a far superior version of HDR than HDR10 with a greater range and color accuracy. Sadly though, many development teams in all fields from monitor production to game creators are focusing on HDR10 support as it simply requires less work and they can still call the content truly HDR. It will be forever a frustration that we'll have multiple types of HDR definitions, but that's frequently the way in tech. You'll always have better versions of the same thing. At least these guidelines are pushing for the best. Okay, now for an area frequently forgotten about when it comes to video consumption, yet quickly realized when it's removed from the scene: audio. In this regard, well, there is a ton of stuff that you can read about if you're interested, but it boils down to object-based audio. No longer should audio be produced with specific channels, but instead have the ability to scale across any number of speakers. And so this kind of, again, boils down to simply two formats which us consumers will really ever use: Dolby Atmos and DTS-X. Of course, again, the audio will be able to be downmixed into classic 2, 5 and 7.1 surround sound setups, but yeah, the future of audio quality is firmly rooted in this fantastically flexible, high quality world. And I'm so excited. I can't wait to be able to have like a setup with speakers in the floor and ceiling. Of course, all this is fantastic, but the issue sadly shines through very quickly with why it won't be implemented anytime soon. We simply don't have the connection speeds required to display this volume of data, and that applies equally to both ends of the pipeline, with many production environments capping out at 2K 120 FPS and home users limited with HDMI and DisplayPort connectivity. Whilst HDMI 2.1 supports 4K 120, the number of users with that connection is like 0.01%. But don't worry, the good news is technology moves quickly, and I'd say within 3 years, everything I've said above will be pretty much standard. The other thing to remember is that these are only guidelines, so until they're all set in stone, they could change, but it's unlikely they're going to see any significant alterations. It's interesting, TV is frequently thought of as a shrinking world, however from the stats I've seen that doesn't appear to be the case, and regardless of whether it is or not, it is still the de facto format for setting future video standards, so we need to pay attention to it in order to see what type of content we can expect both on TVs and our PCs. Anyway, I thought this was quite an interesting bit of news that you'd be interested in hearing about. I like to throw in more nerdy stuff on the channel whenever I can. If you're interested in reading about what true HDR is and any of the other stuff I've talked about, I'll leave some links in the description for you to read through. It's always better to understand the facts behind the technology we use, plus I genuinely think it's interesting. Of course, for anything 21x9 tech or gaming related, head over to my channel page or the WAF website and I'm sure there'll be something of interest there. And if you'd like to support the channel, the links to my Patreon page are in the description and Amazon affiliate links are there too. See you later.